Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel and back to my Hornet Academy for DCS. Today we're going to go over lesson number 12, Introduction to Radios and Communications. So I took about a week break. Last weekend I pumped out something like 14 videos, so I went up to lesson 11 and then I decided to take a week break. And hopefully during that week, those who are following the course um, were able to get in some practice and are either caught up or on their way to getting caught up. So today's lesson, um, we're going to do a quick recap of of previous lessons, where we're at. Then we're going to move on to ATC, which stands for Air Traffic Control. So ATC, airfield communications, which where we're not going to cover any carrier-related communications and any combat-related communications. So just standard airfield ATC comms. That's going to be a couple slides that we're going to go over. And then we're going to jump into the simulator where we're going to show you how we connect to SRS, when we join a server. And SRS is simple radio standalone. I think it's just it's a program that's free that links into your DCS and allows you to use your in-game channels and radios to communicate with your friends in multiplayer. Then we're going to go into the cockpit and we're going to go over the FA-18 Hornet radios and any keybinds to use those radios. And finally, we're going to end the lesson with the F10 menu, and specifically the ATC related comms. And we're going to quickly mention also AirBoss, which is a Moose script that is used for aircraft carrier recoveries, and we'll go over that. So regarding the progress recap so far, lessons 1 through 11, we went over, roughly speaking, we started off with the mission editor, where you were able to set up training and practice missions. We went over the cockpit and how to cold start your jet, and we went over basic flight, slow flight, so stalls, spins, and on-speed flight. And then we went over airfield patterns and takeoffs and landings. So at this point in the course, you should be able to perform all our airfield operations and your basic flight near the airfield. So that's where we're at. And as I had mentioned in previous lessons, the objective of this course is kind of threefold. One is to offer the learning experience in a sequential and structured method on an as-need basis primarily, so not giving any more information than you need to complete that specific lesson, and the concept of mastering a lesson before moving to the next. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at. And then the other thing to mention is I haven't quite done it yet, but I will be adding a certain video references to each of my lessons, because a lot of this stuff is covered in great detail by Matt Wagner or Wags from Eagle Dynamics, Jabbers or other reputable and folks that explain the topic of the lessons, some of the topics, or most of the topics actually, in greater detail and better than I could ever explain them. So my main purpose in the course is to maybe fill in some gaps, maybe explain things from a different perspective, so that it adds to the material that student pilots have available to them when learning the F-18 in DCS. Alrighty, so let's get started with the ATC airfield comm section, and then once that is complete, we'll move on into the simulator. Alright, so let's start with the first slide here. So, when it comes to air traffic control, the first thing I would like to mention is that this is entirely optional, and it's only really required if A, you are in a you're playing multiplayer, and B, if that multiplayer server or the multiplayer group is actually following realistic air traffic control. And C, I guess, is if there is actually manned controllers. So for each of the controller stations or positions or roles. So um, so essentially, if you're playing the single player, you're never going to talk to anybody. This is really you could, in theory, skip some of this lesson and just learn about the radios and in-game comms. But since the purpose of this course is to basically provide you a comprehensive guide, we're going to cover these aspects as well, um, so that those who want to learn and get the full immersion, they can learn it. So let's get started. So the first thing to note about ATC is the comm structure. So um, air traffic control or communications can be daunting and scary to a lot of new pilots, whether in simulators or in real life. You know, it's a lot of kind of structured way to communicate, and there's certain things. There's a lot of information communicated in certain ways, and it seems like it's at the beginning when you start off that there's a lot to to memorize or to understand, which there is. But one thing I wanted to start off everything with is your standard comm structure is the same regardless of who you're talking to, which controller, and you know, whether it's um, regardless of the type of communication you're doing. Typically, I would say 95% of communications um, are in a specific structure. Sometimes, so that structure is this first line here. So essentially, you're saying who you start off the communication always with who you are calling, then you follow it up with who you are, and then where you are, and what you want to do. That's it. So all air traffic control is basically following that structure. And when we go through the you know the examples and the details for each controller, um, just remember, try to identify and try to recognize that structure. So so that you'll see that it is always repeated. And the other thing I'd like to mention is that as as much as air traffic control terminology and messages are um, standardized, and there's certain things that are said, and you will notice that you know there's some flexibility as to what information is included and in which way it is kind of worded. So there's slight variations, and my message to you or advice would be don't focus on the exact term or the exact uh, thing you need to say. Just focus on this overarching goal, and whenever you're making a communication, make sure you're thinking about who you're calling, who you are, where you are, and what you want to do. And you can't really go wrong when you use that format. Sometimes you will, you know, skip the some of these four items, especially once you've established who you're calling and who you are, to make sure that the air traffic comms are brief. So that's the most important thing. Is in aviation there is a single channel typically where you could have upwards of 30 aircraft on it, 40 aircraft, you know, and the last thing you want to do is clog up the airways and prevent somebody from making or receiving an important communication that can, um, you know, become a problem. So let's get started with our first controller. assuming we're starting from the ground, which in most cases we would be. So that would be ground control. So ground control is responsible to make sure that aircraft basically don't collide on the ground. Simply put, that's their main job. And their area of responsibility is from where you're parked on the airport to getting you to a runway. And also from when you land, from when you from the runway to where you want to go to where you want to park. There are also in commercial aviation other people that you speak to, such as clearance delivery or pre-clearance, but that's mostly for airline operations and stuff like that, so don't worry about that. Alrighty, so ground. The way I'm going to do this is now that we know the basic structure, I'm just going to go through examples of what you would say, and yeah, kind of go from there. So when you're on the ground, and we're going to use Kobuleti Airport, as I mentioned, is our training airport, and we're going to use Kobuleti as our example. Winder 1 is the flight call sign that I'm going to use an example. And it is going to be a group of, let's say, I'm going to pretend it's a flight of 2 F-18s, and we're going to use that as the example. So the first thing you would say, you're on the ramp, you've started your jet, and you're ready to go, and you want to go and taxi to the runway at Kobuleti, and this is the first call you would make. So you would say, Kobuleti ground, Winder 1, flight of 2 F-18s at the south ramp, ready to taxi, or you could say request to taxi to the active, and then you'd say which direction you want to depart on, west, north, east, south, or whatever, and you would say information Foxtrot, for example. Now you're wondering, what is the information? Information is okay, how do I put this? There's something there's some basic information regarding the airport at each of the airports that's called ATC, and I believe it stands for Terminal Information System, Aircraft Terminal Information System, or something like that, or aviation. And essentially, it's a pre-recorded message that cycles every hour or so, or and gets updated when weather conditions change. And it basically says things like which is the active runway, where is the wind coming from, what's the altimeter setting, and so on and so forth. So instead of ground control repeating all of that information to you every single time, what they do is they pre-record it and they ask you to tune in to an ATIS frequency and listen to that pre-recorded message. And that message goes from alpha all the way through the phonetic alphabet. So Foxtrot would be your 5th or 6th revision, and then it cycles back through alpha again. So if you look at this call to ground, we have who you're calling, which is Kobuleti ground, who you are, which is Winder 1, where you are, you're at the south ramp, and what you want to do, and you're basically ready to taxi with a west departure. There you go. That's as simple as that. Next, tower will come back and say, hey, Winder 1, Kobuleti ground, taxi to and hold short of runway 25 Sierra Alpha. So they're doing the same thing. They're saying, hey, who you're calling? They're calling Winder 1, which is you. Who are they? They're Kobuleti ground. And obviously they're not going to tell you where they are. They're a fixed controller, but they'll tell you what to do, right? And they'll tell you, they'll give you a clearance. So they'll clear you to taxi up to runway 25 threshold and hold short. And Sierra Alpha are an example of the taxiways that they expect you to take. Sometimes they'll clear you all the way to the runway, and sometimes they'll clear you, only in specific taxiways, and then they'll give you the final clearance. And so yeah, that's it. One thing to make sure of is when you have parallel runways, such as Nellis Air Force Base, make sure that typically good controllers won't clear you through the active runway. But in theory, if they clear you, you're clear to cross the runway. But anyways, I'm not going to go into the details of it. But they've changed regulation for safety right now, and you basically want to hold short and hold. So they'll tell you to hold short, and then tell you to cross that runway to continue your taxi. All right, then you would respond with a read back. So every time a controller tells you something, you want to read it back. And the key thing is you don't need to read back every single thing they told you. You want to read the things that are most important. And because the controllers, they could give you a minute's worth of information, and sometimes, such as an IFR or instrument flight rule clearance, you have to write it all down, read it all back. But in most cases, you don't need to repeat everything. So such as in this case, this is simple enough. You say taxi to runway 25 Sierra Alpha, winder 1. But you could have even said, that's a simple enough that you repeat the whole thing. Next, you'd say once you get to the hold short line of the runway, you say couple to ground, winder 1, holding short runway 25. So again, same structure. Ground would come back and say, winder 1, couple to ground, contact tower button, whatever the button is, or a frequency. Typically in the military aviation, in a Hornet, you've got preset buttons for each for certain frequencies, and so that's what you would probably use. But in case there is no button assigned to that frequency, they might just give you the frequency itself. And you would just say over to tower button whatever. For example, in this case, you don't have to repeat that. All right, next tower. So now you're contacting tower. You're holding short of 25, and you're contacting tower. So you'd say Kublai tower, winder 1, holding short 25. And you could leave it at that. Technically, ground control, could have or should have or typically does give information to tower, so you don't have to repeat everything. The controllers do pass certain information from each other. But if you have any particular request that you didn't tell the previous controller, this is the time you would say it. So for example, you could say request staying in the pattern for touch and goes, or you could reconfirm with them that you're departing to the north or whatever. The reason with ground you say which departure you're going for is because when you're at airports with multiple active runways, they might tell you to go to the runway that best aligns with your departure. Right. All right. Next. So once you're lined up, tower will come back and say, winder 1, Kublai tower, line up. Oh, actually, sorry. Before that, they would tell you to line up and wait, runway 25, or they could clear directly for takeoff. Right? So they could say cleared for takeoff, runway 25. And then once once you're lined up, let's say that tower told you to line up, then they're ready to give you clearance. They would say something like, winder 1, winds 300 at 5, altimeter 2992, clear for takeoff, runway 25. After takeoff, turn right, heading 330, or they could tell you maintain runway heading, climb and maintain 3000. So they could either give you a direction, they could give you an altitude, depending on the airport. So again, it changes from airport to airport. Like some airports, they don't tell you any altitudes. It's up to you. Some of them want you to go to a specific altitude, typically the bigger airports. So you would repeat saying clear for takeoff, right to heading 320, winder 1. So in this case, for example, you don't have to repeat the winds, the wind speed, the altimeter setting, and none of that stuff. Not important. that stuff was just for your information. The stuff that's important is that you've understood the clearance or the direction, what they want you to do. Right? And then at some point, once you have departed, tower would contact you and say, Winder 1, contact departure button, whatever, or they'll give you a frequency, and you would simply say over to departure, or you could say switching departure and the button or the frequency, and end with your who you are, which is Winder 1. So you see, this is an example where we don't have to repeat like Koboledi Tower, and tower is not telling you that they're tower in the previous one, right? So once you have established some communication, you don't have to repeat all of it, right? There you go. So now you're going to departure. So your first call to departure would be something like Koboledi departure. Winder 1 is with you, 2000 for 3000. So that means you have to give your altitude and where you're going if tower told you to go to a different altitude. If not, just give them your current altitude that you're going for, that you're at, if you're not climbing. And you don't have to tell them where you are because departure has a radar, and they will be able to see you on radar. So they're asking for your altitude because they want to confirm that the altitude that they are reading on their radar is correct, and it's just a validation. And departure would come back and say, Winder 1, Koboledi departure, radar contact, turn right heading 320, climb maintain 7000. So essentially, the purpose of departure is to deconflict departing aircraft from the airport. So if you have about 30 aircraft, they're all departing, they're just making sure that they go to different directions, hopefully towards their destination, but not necessarily. With instrument departures, it's a bit different as well. Like, they could give you a standard instrument departure that you have to follow and stuff like that. So you would repeat right to 320, climb, maintain 7000, Winder 1. And essentially you would continue following any vectors that ATC gives you, that departure gives you, until they are satisfied you're out of their airspace, and then they'll tell you to contact a center, or also known as Red Crown in military terms. Center is basically the air traffic controllers that are sitting in some room somewhere, and they direct all instrument flying typically between airports. Um, Anyways, yeah. In visual flight rules, you would not contact center typically, um, but yeah. Anyways, for the purpose of DCS, yeah, typically center um, or Red Crown is just the controller that manages all traffic between airports. So you would say, so sorry, departure would say Winder 1 contact center or Red Crown button, blah blah blah, good day, and you would say over to center, blah blah blah, 12355, Winder 1. Once you contact center, you would say center, or you could say Red Crown, Winder 1 with you. You tell them your altitude, and you say, you basically have your request. So remember our format, who you are, you know, who you're contacting, who you are, where you are, or in the case with these type of controllers, you say your altitude, not where you are. Your altitude is sufficient. And you would say whatever you want. So the three most typical things you would say in a military environment is that you're going to request your own navigation, so they don't bother you anymore, and you just do your thing. Or you could request the vectors to a tanker if you want to practice tanking, or you need to refuel. Or if there is a carrier nearby, you could request vectors intention to get to the carrier. So Red Crown will come back saying Winder 1, Red Crown, radar contact, and then they'll tell you a bunch of different things. So the purpose of Red Crown is to assist you to get you to where you want to go, provide you any useful information that might help you, and also deconflict you with other aircraft. So for example, they might say turn left heading 270, climb maintain flight level 240, or they could say Angels 24 or 24,000. So there's three ways of um, saying altitudes in aviation. So you could say 24,000 or 24,000. Angels is basically thousands, so Angels 24 is 24,000, and flight level is in hundreds, so 240 is 24,000. And then it would say Texaco 1 is bearing 270 for 40 miles, so it's saying that the tanker is in that bearing from you at 40 miles, and that the tanker is at Angels 24, their TACAN is 67 Yankee, and you can contact them on button 15. So it's giving you all your information. The other thing would be in the case of a carrier, it would be like, hey, the carrier is bearing 270 for 80 TACAN. Tell you to turn left to 270, climb maintain Angels 20, or they might give you your own altitude discretion, like you can choose. Or they could even tell you, resume your own navigation. They told you where the carrier is. You should be able to navigate to it yourself. And then they might give you a Marshal button and advise you to contact Marshal prior to entering the CCA, which is the carrier control area. You know, or they might tell you to switch. They might monitor you and tell you to switch to Marshal before you enter that 50-mile area around the carrier. Next, so you would say you would repeat it: red crown, winder 1, left to 270, climb maintain 24, whatever, resuming your own navigation. So as I mentioned, if red crown did not ask you for a frequency change, request it prior to entering the carrier control area. And if not, typically if they're on the ball, they will say winder 1, red crown, contact Marshal button 16 or whatever, and then you would say over to Marshal. Okay. When you're returning to an airfield and you're on red crown, you would say something like, let's say you wanted to get to Kobuleti, go to Kobuleti. You would probably say something like red crown, winder 1, request vectors to Kobuleti. Or if you're doing your own navigation, kind of red crown will monitor your flight and may give you like instructions saying, hey, winder 1, turn right heading 200, and maybe tell you there's traffic or something like that. So lots of things there could be many things. So the important thing is to understand the general gist of it. Don't focus on all the details. So they would come back and say, winder 1, red crown, Kobuleti is bearing 090 for 40. So they're telling it from your aircraft, it's bearing 090. So let's say you're going north. They'll tell you like it's to your right, and it's 40 miles. They'll give you a TACAN of the airfield, and they'll tell you, hey, descend maintain Angels 9, reduce speed to 300. They can tell you that, like perhaps there's traffic in front of you and whatnot. So you would repeat the important stuff as I mentioned earlier, and then they'll come back and say, winder 1, red crown, contact Kobuleti approach on a certain button. And that's when you get within 20 miles of the airport or so. So red crown is done with your general navigation between airports, and at this point you want to contact approach, which basically manage and deconflicts all aircraft approaching for landing, right? So they take you from red crown or center up to near the airfield where you switch the tower. So you'd say something like Kobuleti approach, winder 1 with you 9,000 for 7,000. So again, they have radar contact, so you don't have to tell them where you are. You just tell them your altitude and if you're descending, your new altitude that you're going for. And they might come back and say something like this: winder 1, Kobuleti approach, radar contact 35 miles southwest of Kobuleti, altimeter 2995. Turn right, heading 100, descend and maintain 5,000, expect vectors to 5-mile initial. Visual approach, runway 25, Traffic is flight of 4 Tomcats, 3 o'clock, 5 miles, Angel 7. Yeah, that's a lot of information. um, Most likely you're not going to get all of that at once, but you know that this is just an example. Look, you know, of things that an approach controller might tell you. You know, it's telling you traffic, it's telling you which altitudes and vectors. It's giving you vectors to deconflict you with that traffic. It's telling you what his plans are, which is the active runway. You know, um, what kind of approach you can expect and stuff like that. And out of all of that, all you need to say is right 100, descend maintain 5000, looking for traffic 101. That's it. Look at that. Like he told you like a whole book worth of stuff, and all you have to say is um, those two things. Then you just continue following the vectors from air traffic control, meaning approach. Approach is gonna try to get you onto a final to a runway, right? Um, and for example, let's say when one. Oh, this is what you would repeat. When one departure, turn left and descend, maintain 3000. Report field inside. Oh, sorry. This is what they would say. One of their last calls to you would be Winder 1 departure, turn left heading 250, descend maintain 3000, report field in sight. So 250 would be basically you're heading towards runway 25, roughly speaking, and 3000 would be close to being like your final, like a final altitude before you start descending towards the runway. And report field in sight, is kind of a standard thing that they would ask. Um, Then you could come back when you see the field. You say departure, winder 1, field in sight. And at that point, typically when they will say winder 1, contact Cobble Lady Tower button, blah blah. And that's it. Um, some controllers might not wait for you to see this field in sight, and they might just tell you to contact tower whenever they feel like it. So there you go. Now you are within a few miles of runway 25, and they've told you to contact tower, and this is what would how the comms would look like. So you'd say, Cobble Lady Tower, Winder 1 with you, and any special request you would have for tower goes now. So, for example, if you want an overhead brake, if you want to do touch and goes, if you want full stop, if you want the option, like what do you want to do? You're at the airfield at this point. What do you want to do? There's several things you can do, right? You can do a full stop landing, which is what most towers will expect, unless you tell them something else, right? So then Cobble Tower will come back and say, when you're on Cobble Tower, winds calm, altimeter 2994. You're number 2 behind an E3 on a 2-mile final, runway 25. So, gives you a bunch of information that you don't have to repeat, like the winds and the altimeter. Traffic is important, so typically they tell you traffic so you know which sequence you're in for landing, and also so that you can look for that traffic and make sure you don't hit it. Because remember, at this point, it's all visual flight rules, right? So your eyeballs is your anti-collision avoidance system. You gotta look for other aircraft. And then you would repeat, just saying number 2, traffic is in sight. Traffic in sight, Winder 1. So you acknowledge that you're number 2. You've seen the traffic, and you're gonna follow the traffic. And at some point, the tower would say Winder 1, winds 300 at 5, clear to land. Or they might say clear for left brake or clear for touch and go, runway 25. And then you'd repeat it, and then eventually after you land and you get off on a taxiway, tower will say when you want to contact ground button, blah blah, and you're switching to ground. Once you're on ground, you say Cobble Lady ground, Winder 1 with you at Bravo or whatever taxiway you're on. Request taxi to hangar 2043, for example. And they'll come back and say, when you want to Cobble Lady ground, clear to taxi hangar 43 via Sierra Charlie November. And then you repeat that. And that's your instructions on which taxiways to take to that hangar. regarding instrument to comms, they do get a bit more complex, but it's all the same general idea. And we may cover it in future when we're doing IFR training lessons. And um, the main things about that is there's things like standard instrument departures and arrivals, instrument approaches, and there's a lot more. It's a lot more complicated, the comms typically, but to be honest, I haven't seen it really used in DCS, so this is just for your information. Uh, any semi-serious online community will likely use what I've just described above for visual um, for operations around airfields. Most you know most online servers and communities probably will only have things like um, tower, um, and they won't have all of these other controllers. The other thing is, for 99% of your flying, you won't have any controllers on any of these stations. So, and I forgot to cover this, but basically, when you have an uncontrolled airfield, what you want to do is you want to announce the things that you would normally announce or communicate with, say, tower or with ground. So, um, when the controllers, like such as ground and tower, are unmanned, um, the airport turns into will have a common traffic advisory frequency, or CTAF usually it's called. Um, and typically that'll be the same as the tower frequency, for example. And what the basic gist of it is you basically instead of saying who you're calling, because there's nobody to call to, all you would do is say who you are, where you are, and what you want to do, and you keep announcing that over and over and over and over again. And for example, let's say you're at the ramp and you want to go to the active and there's no tower. So instead of saying Cobble ground, Winder 1, flight of 2 F-18s at the south ramp, ready to taxi, west departure with Foxtrot, the people who are around the pattern or around the airfield, they don't care what information you have, and they certainly won't give you permission. Like you don't need permission to do anything. Um, so wherever you see um, ground or tower, essentially you would change that with traffic. So you would say cobulated traffic instead of cobulated ground or cobulated tower. So you would say, for example, cobulated traffic, Winder 1, flight of 2 F-18s at the south ramp. Instead of saying ready to taxi, you would say taxiing to runway 25 with a west departure. In fact, you wouldn't even say the departure, because um, you already know, you would say that later. So that's all you would say. And then once you get to near the runway, you would say, um, Copoletti traffic, Winder 1 is holding short to runway 25, and you would check to see if there's anybody landing or whatnot. If there is, you just wait, right? And you wait for them to land, and then if there's nobody, or if you're free to go, you would say, Copoletti traffic, Winder 1 departing runway 25. And that means that you're taking the active runway, right? And you're telling, and then you could say like west departure, right? So they know that you are taking off and you're going, on a west departure. The other thing is, when you are in the pattern, you would announce each leg of your pattern. Remember when we talked about the airfield patterns, how it's got all those legs, like upwind and crosswind and downwind. So every time you are, there's other aircraft around and there's no tower controller, you would say, for example, once you've departed and you turn to crosswind, you'd say, um, you know, quality traffic, Winder 1, left crosswind, runway 25, if you're on a left pattern. Then when you're on downwind, you would say quality traffic, Winder 1, left downwind, runway 25. Then on base, you would say left to base. And then on final, you would say calculated traffic, winder 1, short final, runway 25. So you would land, and you would say, you want to say when you're clear of the active. The active meaning the active runway. When you're clear of it, you would say calculated traffic, winder 1, clear of runway 25. And then same thing, you'd be like calculated traffic, winder 1, at taxiway alpha, taxiing to south ramp, so they know where you are. And that's it. You're basically announcing all of the things that you would typically read back or announce to a controller, but you're not asking for permission. You're just doing it and you're announcing it. So, and the more you talk, the better. That way, people know exactly where everybody is, and there won't be any surprises. There's a lot of accidents that happen in uncontrolled airfields around the world, and the main reason is because there's either poor communication, insufficient communication, um, and yeah, that's so better to over communicate. All right, guys, that's it. Considering how long that took, I'm gonna divide this into two parts. So that will be the ATC ground theory portion uh, of the lesson, and now we can and for the part two, we're gonna go jump into the cockpit and go over the radios and the menu as I discussed earlier. So hopefully that helped, and yeah, see you in part two of lesson 12.